So as I've explained in one of the videos in this series, the kind of opposition of subject and object is that which arose from the initial sense of Dasein. And this initial sense of Dasein is not a sort of metaphysical unity, not a sort of thing that is seen as this kind of big one from which all kind of stems from, not a sort of, let's say, metaphysical absolute. It is much more the kind of horizon from which being discloses itself in the form of beings in the world. Now, this seems like a lot of, like, let's say, mix of poetical jargon, but it becomes clear why such a investigation into, let's say, the fundamental ontology of these practices is necessary. And this it is necessary if you see the kind of alternative approaches, the kind of alternative aborted approaches to identity, to truth, to science, such as the school of thought that Jung adhered to. It hasn't been given the philosophical drive which it needed, and which is to be found in works such as the works of Heidegger. It doesn't have to be Heidegger's works, but you can find it in there. And what lies in it is, instead of generating a system such as Hegel, it creates its own negation within it. So it contains its own negation and its own kind of sense of inaccessible concealment within it. It is clear that what is being constructed is a question, die Seinsfrage, the question of being, and it is not something that is being answered with a recipe. It is a sort of quasi-system when you look at Dasein, but it isn't a proper system. It is a system that is left open. It is left open in the way that whoever identifies with it may grow it further, just as in the same way the self is left open with Jung, and the self is inhabited by the so-called archetypes. The archetypes being, for example, the archetype of the anima and animus, the symbolically feminine, the symbolically masculine, the great mother, the great father. You get the trickster figure, you get the shadow, as we've talked about it. And what you get there is that the archetypes are not a exhaustive list with a set number of elements in it. There's not a set number of archetypes, and there's not set properties of these archetypes. You cannot exhaust that list. It is not a set system of metaphysics. In a sense, it is this sort of growing unfoldment of a narrative. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to tap into your own narrative. You're trying to access this sort of source. And you can see that in the development in Heidegger's thought, that he starts off with one leg in the systemic thinking and one leg in this kind of opening up of the system. And throughout the progression from being in time towards his latest essay, Time and Being, Zeit und Sein, you get this full dissolution and this kind of encounter with what he calls the event, the Ereignis, das Ereignis. And so das Ereignis, in a sense, is this assembly of the opposites in the ongoing narration. So in the reaching of being from future across present to the past, to the have been, there is this kind of assembly of these elements that you cannot summarize to one whole. So the event in that sense is something that immediately conceals itself. It is something that assembles them, but you cannot ask about the event. As soon as you ask about the event, you have kind of destroyed that structure again that you're thinking about. In a sense, the event is kind of the totality without the whole, and the whole without its parts. And at the same time, it seems to string them together. And so through these realms that represent the initial kind of time frame, not the linear time that is an abstraction, but this initial, what you'd call the ecstasies of temporality, the ecstasies of future, present, and what he sometimes refers to as the have been or the past. And this is this kind of disclosure of this essential mystery, and this disclosure in which we find the narration that is ongoing, the narration that is happening, this sort of source in which all of our abstractions have been extracted from, but which we have buried under these abstractions in the form now of techniques, of systems, of cybernetics. And in order to free ourselves from it, in order to get out of it, one needs to verwinden, one needs to twist out of the entanglements. A question that often comes up in terms of self and sense of self and consciousness in that regard is often also the question of the consciousness of machines, which we often talk about in this channel. And it is important to note that one engages in that false opposition of subject and object if one asks about the phenomenal consciousness of machines, for example, whether there's a subject lying in that box, because it stems from the assumption that there is a subject lying in this box. And this assumption is nested in a sort of attempt at metaphysics, because essentially what metaphysics does is create these oppositions and then try and let one pole of that opposition rule over the other. And in this case, it is the opposition of the spirit and the matter, and an attempt of the matter to rule over the spirit, meaning that the sort of physical processes in the brain are meant to determine the contingent byproduct, the epiphenomenon of an arising, emerging consciousness. And that is equally rested and rooted in this metaphysical abstraction as the opposite is, where you have the idealist system where you've got the spirit and the matter, and the spirit is elevated above the matter, and matter becomes a mere kind of epiphenomenal byproduct instantiation of, let's say, the absolute spirit, for instance. And the question here lies more rather in what is it that technology represents. And technology represents a sort of instantiation of the mode of being, the mode in which being discloses itself to us in the form of processable resources and data. So what we get is this sort of post metaphysical age of cybernetics, of systems, in which all identity is merely a system of profiles. All identity is merely, as what Möller would call prophelicity, a system of second-order observation. And in that sense, machines also can exhibit the same sort of second-order observational behavior that conscious entities such as humans would have. So in that sense, the human that has become a sort of cybernetic, systematized, machinic entity has dissolved its consciousness and outsourced it into various machines, and these machines fulfill these functions. So you can say that consciousness on one hand performs some sort of linguistic task, and then you have language models that can replicate that as language becomes a cybernetic systemic process and correlational entanglement of words and phrases according to some statistical evaluation. But the kind of view that there is some sort of separate essential subject stuck in this head, in this box, and another separate subject stuck in the box of the machine is a kind of, one could say, error in category. Möller talks about this when he talks about artificial communication. So it is an error of category, as if you look at the systems that are in place, then consciousness is not a system that is being built. Consciousness is essentially something that is structurally coupled to the system of communication. And what we've done with artificial intelligence, quote unquote, is that we have generated an abstraction of what communication used to be. So it is a more second order observation based abstraction of communication. So you instead of seeing that you're communicating with some separate conscious entity, you are communicating with a processed abstraction of 100,000 other people. It is being rerouted towards it. You're basically looking into a mirror of the data output of society. And just like looking into a mirror and seeing yourself doesn't mean you can conclude that because the entity you see in the mirror is conscious, that the mirror is conscious. You cannot conclude that this machine in that sense would contain the sort of subjective consciousness it does. However, this does not mean that I'm making the opposite argument. This does not mean that I'm saying, no, only we have consciousness and they don't, because it would still be stuck within that subject-object paradigm. And we know that even machines, as we can see in the famous painting that won the art prize, that even machines can generate some, let's say, novel entities. Even machines seem to be turning into something that can generate a new encounter of the world. And that is not surprising, because the techniques itself is not something that is like the sum totality of our tool usage or some externalization of certain techniques out to some physical processes. It is, to some extent, all of that, but on the other hand, it is also a sort of realm of encountering the world and a realm of a certain ontology of how the world discloses itself to us. And what we get here is that we have this particular structure leading to entities that are, let's say, of a different sort, but that seem to resemble entities such as the archetypes, that seem to resemble the kind of autonomous structures such as the ego, and thus can be seen as conscious and necessitate, for example, at some point people to act as if they were. To look back at the map of the self that Jung had characterized, you would see that the image may be inverting to some extent, that the ego is turning into the shadow, and that the archetypes of the unconscious are exteriorizing, that they're becoming external in the form of artificial intelligent entities. This was it for this part, and I will see you in the next part of this lecture series.